Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this week's 120 Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum of Dublin. As our guest this evening, I'm really absolutely thrilled to be joined by author and social entrepreneur, Ruairí McKiernan. Ruairí, I'm thrilled to have you here. Thank you so much.
Hi, Sarah. Great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Very, very happily. How are you doing?
Really good. Yeah, it was a lovely day here. I'm in Lahinch in County Clare, and yeah, I suppose the last week was a little bit stormy and wild and housebound and all that. So today I got to get out and about, which was nice.
Brilliant. I think we've all come to enjoy and appreciate our walks in a way that we possibly never have up until this point. But to everyone joining us this evening, thank you so much for being here. If you've got questions, please do type them in and we will get asking Ruairí some of those questions as we go through the evening. But Ruairí, I'm going to just jump straight in and start us off and ask you a question. So we're here this evening, obviously, to have a chat about Hitching for Hope, your new book, which I've thoroughly enjoyed reading in the last couple of days. Now, you had the kind of unusual experience of launching this book during the pandemic as it was beginning at the start back in March. But I do see you managed to achieve the #1 non-fiction position in the Irish Times chart. What must that have been like as an experience?
Yeah, it was pretty intense now, I have to say. So firstly, I would say the book is about hope during turbulent times. So you can see the relevance immediately in turbulence. And I suppose the second thing to say is that I never set out to write a book in this particular journey, and I never aspired to be a writer or anything like that. So the motivation behind the book was this. I mean, you often hear it said, is like, I didn't feel I had a choice. It felt like it had to be written and it just wouldn't go away until I relented. And it did take me a few years. I was quite stubborn. And I made a bit of an ass of it here and there and I had to rework it. I felt like some kind of amateur building a house. And in the end, I built 3 houses and had to knock out walls and put on new roofs and everything. So look, it was kind of like learning a craft, you know, and I was very conscious that I was learning, and I'm a big believer in taking on challenges and growing and learning. But when it did come time to release the book after several years writing it, the date for the release was March 26th, and I had a big launch planned in Eason's O'Connell Street. Lynn Ruan and Francis Black were going to speak. It's going to be brilliant. Colin McInerney was going to perform. And then to make things bigger, I was going to go all around Ireland and launch it in 7 other venues. So what's come to be known as, I guess, COVID-19 and the pandemic hit, and the country went into lockdown on that same very week. So I'm given way too much context. You can see why it took me a long time to write a book. I'm terrible for context. But yeah, it was rough in one way. But you know what? I just made a decision in that moment to make the most out of it. And having spent 20 years in the community sector and the charity sector and campaigning, I'm sort of used to being up against it, you know. I'm used to not having enough resources, enough time, enough people. I'm used to things not going my way, or it's almost intrinsic in the realm of social change that you're kind of swimming against adversity, you know. So I suppose there's a certain amount of resilience within me that was able to adapt. And then I suppose I've spent so long running online, doing websites and campaigns and all the rest, I was able to adapt to the Zoom world fairly quickly. So immediately had a series of online events, and thankfully community rallied behind me, rallied behind the book, and it had a brief moment as #1. So I won't claim that it was a huge prolonged glory, but it was a nice while it lasted.
Oh, well, for the book that fought to be written, that's quite an amazing accomplishment. It's a wonderful thing, and it's fascinating just to hear the kind of the context and the experience. And I'm going to actually ask you about a little bit more context. As you mentioned there, you know, your career prior to this was in the kind of the social space, and some people with us this evening may know that you were the founder of an organization called Spun Out. But for those of them who aren't, you might just tell me a little bit about the organization and kind of the problem that it was responding to.
Yeah, no probs. So here I go again with too much context, but briefly, I have a degree in business, and like many young Irish people, you do a degree or studies in an area that you may not be best suited to. But I had a particular interest in that area, but worked for a few multinationals in my early 20s and fairly quickly realized that what was really calling to me or speaking to me was the kind of social sector, the community sector. And I ended up getting a very basic admin job in the Northwestern Health Board in Donegal. And through there, I was able to kind of learn on the job the ropes of what was effectively health promotion, and specifically working with young people around health issues. And within that, had a specific focus on sexual health and mental health. And what those two topics or issues have in common are that they tended to have been less and less so, but still to some extent, there's a degree of stigma attached to them in Irish society for a whole variety of cultural and historical factors. We tend not to be overly comfortable talking about sex or the realms of depression, suicide, you name it. Now, thankfully, in the 15 or 20 years since I've been doing this, things have changed massively. And I think we're on a positive trajectory, but have still a long way to go. So that, in many ways, was the motivation. And I realized at that time that the state and state structures aren't always the best places for innovation. They can get drowning in red tape and bureaucracy and all the rest. So I decided to start a nonprofit and a charity, and was joined fairly quickly with friends and allies and people from across a variety of sectors. So I can't pretend that I was on my own or a hero in any way. It was a whole community effort. And I'm always a big believer in the idea of the community effort. And even the book is a mehel effort, where the people who proofread it and helped edit it, and the publishers and the graphic designers, like nobody does anything on their own. So, that's been a big part of my journey.
Yeah, and I remember watching when you were talking about your time at Spun Out and kind of leading to the decision to step away. I really enjoyed the TEDx talk that you did, and I'm going to quote here that I remember you saying, I felt like I was being a fraud. I was promoting well-being, but not my own. Like, talk to me a little bit about when you decided to step back and kind of what your thoughts were. It was about 8 years in, am I correct?
Yeah, so it was probably towards the end of my journey with Spun Out. So I'd kind of led the whole, the founding of anything is really tough slog. You start off in your bedroom, eventually you rent a dingy office, then you get a grant, or you're able to bring in some revenue, and you build it up progressively, and then you might win an award, and then slowly you're going and going, and then you hire staff, but it never ends. And so particularly at that time in my mid-20s to early 30s, I guess, I didn't necessarily have what I might call the self-mastery or the self-discipline, or even the right supports in place to manage myself correctly, in a positive or a healthy way. So it wasn't that I had like terrible behaviors or anything, but the biggest kind of behavior challenge, I suppose, was overwork. And you might even argue there's a touch of work addiction there, but I think that's a societal issue as well, and anyone that's tuning in here, hello to everyone for a start. I'd love to know where people are watching from or tuning in from. And thanks for your time. It's great to connect with people and feel that we're all part of a kind of a community gathering here. It'd be great to do it in person, but it's nice to do it this way as well. So yeah, the whole kind of feeling like becoming a fraud was that, like, a lot of what was coming out of my mouth was about minding ourselves and looking after ourselves and being kind to each other and kind to our mind and health and well-being. And like, I was just becoming deflated, fatigued, burnt out, slightly agitated. And I don't know, but I think there was probably a touch of depression, or a depression descending upon me. And I just knew that I couldn't show up with full integrity. And, I'm a big believer in the whole Gandhi philosophy of be the change you want to see in the world. And if you're not really walking your talk, then what are you doing? So I just knew at that moment in time that it was over for me, and that I had to say goodbye to that particular episode of my life, and sometimes it's good to know when to say goodbye as well.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a strength in that. And that idea of kind of anxiety and depression and just kind of tough moments, that that's something that we're very much going to talk about later. I might ask you kind of thoughts and advice that you can give to all of us from your own experiences based on the pandemic that we're currently living through. But just to kind of finalize the context in which the book comes into your own life, like after you leave Spun Out, you get a call from the president one day, and that becomes quite a key moment.
Yeah. I see you've got a special guest there somewhere behind you.
So my partner will hopefully be redirecting the noise.
Your partner there is not human form in the barking sense.
He's currently running down the stairs to pick up the bark. I apologize.
No, it's all good. Everyone's welcome. So the call from the president was not that long after I left Spun Out. I was gone a few months, and Michael D. Higgins had just been elected president, and I had met him a handful of times, mainly at conferences and events where, social justice, community youth kind of things. I'd annoyed him once on a train to Galway where I was canvassing him around suicide prevention when he was a TD. So he kind of knew who I was, but he didn't know me massively. We weren't friends or anything like that. And I've never been a member of, wasn't involved in a political party or anything like that. So, but he was forming a council of state. The president of the day gets 7 appointees. There's generally about 20 something. The ex-Taoiseach presidents, attorney general, there's a whole sort of what are called ex officio office holders are automatically on the council of state, but the president of the day gets 7 appointees, and then I was asked to be one of them. So it was a huge honor, and it felt like I suppose a sign that I was on the right path, even though I felt like I was on the wrong path because things weren't necessarily working out. I wasn't bringing in an income. I didn't have enough energy to get fired up again. But you know what it's like when you're going through a hard time and you might be feeling a bit lost, and suddenly something good happens, and it's like a little wink from the universe to tell you to keep going, And within that, and as part of the overall story of this book, I guess in some sense it created a platform for me that it gave me a certain amount of agency and access. Not that the Council of State bestows any great power. It's an honorary role for the most part. There's some advisory functions, and it's certainly an unpaid role. But I suppose I felt duty bound then to use that to whatever advantage I could on behalf of those that maybe don't have a voice as well.
Okay, it's speaking of kind of people most generally, just kind of I'm seeing loads of people responding to your question of where everyone's joining us from this evening, so let's just see where people are joining from.
Sacramento,
we got Liz,
Virginia. Yeah, cool.
We have a guest joining us from the Mosney Provision Centre, from Spain, from Virginia,
Lisbon,
and USA,
Portugal,
Sacramento, Lucan, County Dublin, then Lurgan, County Armagh. It's people joining us from various continents and
Canada, Ontario.
That's
wow.
Wonderful. I'm delighted to see where everyone's from. I'm thrilled you asked.
Yeah, that's cool.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's when kind of lovely to see what different environments everyone's joining us from, and which kind of speaking of people coming from different environments. Rory, one of the challenges that you were given was you were saying you were invited to an event to speak about citizens' views for the future. And that triggered quite a key moment that has led us to being here this evening. You might tell us what journey you embarked on.
Yeah, so some people might be familiar or maybe not with a conference that's known as the McGill Summer School in Ireland. It tends to be a kind of a lot of politicians go there, policymakers, analysts, commentators. Every summer, it's like a think tank kind of conference. I'd spoken at it before, and to be quite frank, I was asked to speak, and I didn't really want to. So the big thing that was happening in the world at the same time was the Celtic Tiger economy, which was effectively a 10, 15-year period where, to those that maybe aren't so familiar, was a period where Ireland went from, you could say, a sort of a poor country to a wealthy country. Now, not everyone had all the wealth, so we'll put that proviso there. But there was a massive amount of economic and social change in the country, some of it good, some of it bad. The country spiraled into a very, very deep recession where over a number of years, up to 300,000 people emigrated. There was mass unemployment, job losses. people losing their businesses and their homes, including people that I know. And there was a kind of a gloominess in the air. So I was asked to come to this summer school to speak about citizens' views of Ireland. And my view was that I didn't know what I had to say that was of any use, or would it be of any great difference to inspire anybody to do anything. And I felt also there were too many experts and too many voices pontificating from the stages and not enough listening going on. So I was inclined to reject the invitation until I reminded myself of the platform that I had and that I wanted to use this platform. So the idea came to go around Ireland and ask people their views around where they were at. But then I tried to drill into what was the question I was looking for. And ultimately it was a question around hope. And this is where the personal element kicks in. Like, in one sense, it was a social listening project. And then on the other sense, it was, I guess everything we do is personal in a sense, So I feel it was this pilgrimage of this kind of guy who was sort of flirting with the notion of emigration as well, and feeling a little bit lost and feeling a bit frustrated and possibly angry with Ireland and the lack of leadership and the lack of hope, and wanting to go out just open to find out where answers are and where the hope was and hear people's voices. And then the next question was, well, how will I get around Ireland? I thought about driving, and I thought bus, train, and they didn't seem like viable ways of going where I could organically meet people in a unplanned, raw and real way. And then this mad idea came in to hitchhike. And, immediately it just felt like a crazy idea, but sometimes the crazy ideas are the ideas that have the most gold, So you have to kind of watch that logical part of your mind to check. Yeah, sure, sometimes ideas are just bonkers and they shouldn't be done. But, if you think about like the little museum of Dublin, or football clubs or schools or anything that was ever started by somebody, potentially people thought it was a crazy idea, So this hitchhiking, it appealed at a certain level because I love traveling. I love meeting people. I hadn't hitchhiked in many, many years. And I liked the idea of getting out of my comfort zone and having an adventure.
And had you hitchhiked before? Had that been kind of a key part?
Yeah, so I grew up hitchhiking in County Cavan, in rural Cavan, where I grew up in Cootehill. So hitching for most rural Ireland at that time was a means to an end to just get around. There was no transport. And in fact, a lot of families certainly didn't have a second car, and some families didn't have any car. So hitchhiking was just a normal means of transport when I was growing up. And then I had hitchhiked in a few different countries in the US, Canada, New Zealand, and a few others. But I hadn't done it in a long, long time. And I in many ways, got lazy and got comfortable and didn't really want any hardship in my life. So why would I want to go stand in the rain? It's not necessarily the most practical way of getting around. And also over the years, it's said that hitchhiking has died, and you wouldn't typically see many hitchhikers. And then there's a narrative of fear around it as well, whereby we're kind of told that hitchhiking is dangerous both for the hitchhiker and for the person picking them up. So everybody's afraid of everybody effectively. Now, part of the curiosity in the book is this exploration of the fear, and I do want to name that some of it is absolutely merited, in the sense that there is violence in the world and there are dangerous people in the world. And I would particularly emphasize the fact that there is more violence towards women quite often in certain instances and in certain ways. And I think that's absolutely an imbalance and injustice in our world. And I see it with my wife and women in my world, that why don't women have the same freedom or right or safety to walk the streets at night, for instance, So we could talk about that all day, but it is a factor, there's almost a privilege to be able to go hitchhike and not worry about my safety.
It's a funny one, because that is kind of one of the messages that was kind of sitting in the back of my own brain when thinking about the prospect of what your journey must have been like, that there is the female caution that goes into kind of worrying about your safety and your vulnerability. But it's I was also kind of wondering what the kind of reality of standing outside, cold, wet November weather, kind of going, what on earth was I thinking? like kind of what the reality was actually like?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't. It depends on the day, doesn't it? You know, Ireland is unpredictable. So that's what I mean. If you don't need to go hitchhiking, then it can be weather dependent. So in this particular trip, I did start out in cold, blustery days, even though, you know, the book starts off at a kind of summertime. But thankfully the sun started shining and I felt like the sun carried me right through this trip. But there is something liberating about standing at the side of the road and having your thumb out and just, I don't know, I like the kind of the not knowing of who's going to pick you up, how long is it going to take. I like the same feeling going to an airport. I just like the taking off bit, you know. And I think, you know, if I'm going to end up standing there for an hour or 2 hours, then that's a whole different story. But you know, if you stick to rural roads for the most part and you look halfway friendly and, you know, non-threatening, you're going to get a lift for the most part. So what I've tended to find, and the book talks about this a lot, like the average waiting time tended to be like 10 to 20 minutes. And so there's a nice pocket of time where you can stand at the side of the road and daydream. And, you know, sometimes it's just nice to do that. Although with mobile phones, I've tended to find that whole daydreaming liminal space is being diminished from our worlds and our lives, because one of the first things we do, or I'll speak for myself, one of the first things I do is go and check one of the many apps and many messages and find out what insanity is happening in the world right now, you know, and God knows there's any amount of it. So sometimes it's just nice to stare at the clouds and forget about the phone. And I don't know, hitchhiking can kind of open up some different ways of being as well.
Yeah, it's a lovely way of thinking about it. We have introduced a policy in this house where come 7 o'clock when I close the laptop each Thursday evening, it's tech free until the next morning, and it's a nice novelty in itself. But like you were saying that when your journey was like when you were kind of planning to go on this journey originally, when you were starting out, that the idea and the kind of the topic that you were exploring was this idea of hope. What, just to kind of unpack that a little bit, what does hope mean, or what did hope mean as a description at that time to you?
Yeah, you know, it's funny that hope is such a controversial word in a sense, and sometimes it can be attributed to religion, and sometimes it can be attributed to some people can dismiss it as well, that it's a false emotion or a false feeling that um you know, there's going to be a knock on the door and all your problems are going to go away, you know, that um but so for me, hope is, yeah, there's an element of future sense and future navigation, where there's a feeling that you're on a positive path, or that, you know, down the road lies somewhere you want to be. And that can be for ourselves in a personal scenario, and it really comes into play when we're in the shits, doesn't it? Like, you know, whether it be relationship, family, health, politics, um economics, finances, when things aren't going well, like that feeling that you have, that you can withstand that and you can push through that and you can hold firm if hope is around the corner. But I suppose this becomes another theme that I explore, whereby I don't necessarily believe in a passive hope. I believe in an active hope, and I believe that hope needs action, and that they're one and the same things, you know, that it isn't something that we just sit and wait to come and you know, come upon us. It's something that I feel we need to manifest. And like the action bit is key. And I suppose I've always been a believer in activism, and whatever form that takes is up to each individual, but action creates hope. And I think that's one of the messages that emerged out of the trip and the book.
Yeah, and when you're talking about kind of this proactive, action-based response. When myself and yourself were catching up last week, I remember scribbling down a couple of words that you wrote, and in the back of my head saying, you must ask about that. We were talking about this idea of cultivating strength during a difficult time, and the idea of being able to put yourself in a situation to be able to do a mindset reset. You might just unpack that a little bit for us and tell me what you were talking about.
A mindset reset. Yeah, I suppose some of it comes down to this self-awareness that things need to change. In, like, you know, we all have days where we know what we want to change in the world, and we want things to be better, and we want better decisions, better policies, better leadership. But if you take it on to the individual level, one of the greatest powers we have is our perspective and our minds and how we view the world. And I think one of the great gifts that can come with hardship and suffering and arguably problems or challenges that come upon us is that they can present the opportunity to kind of reframe things and to do a reset and to flip how you can view life. And it's not to kind of overly sugarcoat or spiritualize problems, because problems are real and you can't really deny someone's suffering when it is, particularly when it's rooted in injustice. But at the same time, I'm always kind of fascinated by a lot of the great leaders, civil rights and human rights leaders, and the classic example of Nelson Mandela in the prison. And so many of them have emerged out of incarceration and injustice with some kind of an aura about them, something that was different, that set them apart fundamentally from other leaders. And for me, there's this sense that they found liberation in incarceration. And it's an interesting metaphor when you think about lockdowns and you think about having our rights and our freedom stripped away from us. And I am thinking of Mo tuning in direct provision, and I'm thinking of, I say a lot of these things from a certain point of privilege as well. But I do know that, well, I hope you don't mind me picking on you, Mo. I happen to know Mo, and she's a great campaigner. I met her through an Amnesty event. So many of these wonderful people I've met, including Mo, they have huge real challenges in life, but are able to kind of radiate something. And I wish I could bring Mo on the screen here, but there is something about that mindset. You know, I think it's a decision. I think it's a fight, and I think it's courage as well. But I also think there's sometimes a humility required, whereby we have to admit that we don't know. And, sometimes that kind of not knowing can be a place of liberation as well. And if you sit with the not knowing, then sometimes the answers will come. And I think when we want to get ourselves out of this lockdown, we want to get ourselves out of the pandemic, but maybe it's worth kind of considering the idea of letting go with the fight of being in it, because it's a reality. And yeah, okay, we wanted maybe Tony Holohan or Neffet to do things differently, or some people want to believe it's a hoax, all that kind of stuff. But personally, I don't mind people challenging the narrative, and that's an important role. But I'm also finding that there's the potential for a great reset for humanity in this moment in time. And that reset can be very dark and dangerous, and it can lead to a very, very dark road of authoritarianism in one form or another. Or it can be a reset for humanity in the sense that we were probably marching off an ecological cliff and things were not going in a good direction. And perhaps we can seize this opportunity for a reboot nationally and globally. Now, there are people that will immediately seize upon some of this language and say I'm part of some globalist conspiracy theory that I'm advocating. And this is a real thing, by the way. My Facebook is increasingly plenty of conspiracy on it. So first of all, I'm not associated with any global elite that I'm aware of, and I'm certainly not on the payroll that I'm aware of. But you know, I think these changes have to come about by personal change as well, and that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not doing it in the most graceful, eloquent way, because I've probably spent a few days looking at the US election and destroying my mind. But you know, I think a reset of our own minds and perspectives can be a healthy thing, but also a painful thing.
Yeah, I think we've probably all pressed the refresh button way too many times.
Yeah, I think I've just noticed my neurological circuitry is slightly frazzled here.
But I kind of I do kind of see where you're coming from, what you're saying, and I do think inevitably one way or another there will be change that comes out of this particularly interesting year, or difficult year, just to kind of call a spade. But when you're talking about this kind of human experience and kind of lived experience, I actually don't think I've asked you yet. Would you just kind of give people a little bit of a sense of, you know, the journey that you went on, the people that you met, the places that you traveled to, kind of some of the experiences that you had during that time?
Yeah. Okay. So this trip started off. I just see someone in the chat box of the Zoom asking when it took place. It took place about 7 years ago. It was kind of post Celtic Tiger collapse. The book took me a very long time to write, which is a whole story in itself. But it started off it actually started off in my mother's house. I'm originally from Cavan, but my mother now lives in Connemara in Spiddle. And I, you know, did what all good Irish guys do, went to visit their mother and got well fed, and then got almost too well fed, where I almost didn't want to leave because I got lazy again. And I started off, and my first lift was in McKiernan, and it was by a guy called David, who, interestingly enough, I never, as I said earlier, I never intended to write a book. So I never had contact details for all the people in the book. And when it came time to publish it, I had to go find all these people again and get permission. Well, I wanted their permission, you know, and one or two people I couldn't find. I changed names and I changed details and so on. But I found this guy, David, again. Anyway, Ireland's so small, you can find people, you know, if you have a vague detail. So David was a guy who was going through a hard enough time himself, economically, as a lot of people were. And he had, you know, son abroad, and he was just talking about, like, I suppose, the frustration and anger he was feeling, but then some of the joy that he was finding in tending to bees and keeping beehives. And then he goes into this whole thing that dissects the kind of pharmaceutical industry and the petrochemical industry, where he talks about the control that companies like Monsanto have on seed and food supply globally, which is an entirely fascinating topic, particularly when you looked at the start of the pandemic and where our food was coming from and feeling that there might be scarcity. So, you know, what can start out as just this random lift in McKiernan, Galway, and becomes a whole analysis of our food supply, of seeds, but also a kind of a reflection on where an individual finds joy and finds connection with ecology and with nature. And then also a reference to traditional Irish music in that conversation. And then on to Uachtarard, where I pop into a youth centre. I talk to them about, you know, providing alcohol-free alternatives for young people. And then I met a young woman there, an interesting young woman who's American, but was facing deportation because whatever her family circumstances brought her to Ireland when she was younger. She had never she didn't have the correct documents. So that became a kind of, I suppose, an interesting reflection on citizenship, rights, race, you know, even direct provision as well, like who gets deported, who's the right to say, who's more equal than the other person. And then I ended up that night in Inishbofin Island. You know, it's an amazing thing, Ireland being so small. Sometimes we don't appreciate it, that you can set off in the morning and be on an off-coast island that evening, you know. And I woke up that night in a tent at about 5 a.m, shivering, cold and wet and miserable, and wanting to go home and just said, this is a disaster. What have I done? This is just daft. and then finding like the local backpacker kind of travel hostel and going in, and a guy called Brennan emerging out of nowhere like a fairy, just going, hey, and making me coffee and porridge. And instantly I'm on this journey of kindness, and people sort of looking after me and making me food, and other people donating money through PayPal. And so there was no plan as to who I was going to meet, where I was going to go. I didn't set off with any budget. It just was a whole thing where it took a life of its own. And from Inishbofin, I found out that Damien Dempsey, the singer, was on the island. So I went chasing Damien Dempsey to try and interview him about hope. I couldn't find Damien Dempsey, and it turned into this kind of Benny Hill disaster, I suppose, comedy show where I was chasing Damien Dempsey around the island. And then next thing, I'm going off the island on the ferry, and somebody tells me I was standing right beside him all along, and I just missed him. And so there's lots of kind of humor that emerged in the trip, and I document that in the book as well. And soon after that, I ended up in a mart where farmers are selling animals in Mam Cross in Connemara, and witnessed a lot of hurt, a lot of anger there, people feeling neglected, unheard, people disenfranchised with politics, with the EU, with government, farmers selling their animals, talk of suicide, talk of depression, young farmer on antidepressants. So real suffering, real hardship. And then on to Croagh Patrick, where I climbed what is effectively Ireland's most kind of sacred or holy mountain, even going back to pre-Patrick, which would be an interest of mine, that it was a pilgrimage mountain before Christianity as well. So a lot of what emerges throughout the book is this kind of reflection and assessment of Ireland and the role of religion as well, because most or many of us have been brought up with certain traditions, the majority being Catholic. That has changed significantly, of course, but many of our rituals and our cultural and institutional structures have religious kind of influences. But I'm also interested in the pre-Christian as well, and the fact that Ireland had many traditions before, and that, I suppose, comes into play later in the book towards the end, where I ended up on the hill of Ishnock and the hill of Tara, and I'm kind of reflecting on this kind of ancient Ireland as well.
And it's fascinating to hear that there's so many different themes and so many different layers in terms of the kind of the people that you're meeting, their own backgrounds, their interests, their knowledge, just the kind of the whole dialogue of it. But like on a very human level, like you were going on a journey discussing this idea of hope. Like were there kind of a couple, like one or two key sentiments that it didn't matter how varied their lives and circumstances were? Was there any kind of commonalities that shone through every person that you met?
Yeah, and I would say, like, as we think about elections right now, without wanting to get into it too much, and Lynn Ruairí captures this quite well. She's kind of got a blurb on the front cover of the book, but the summary of it is that she says, Hitching for Hope demonstrates that we all want the same things: to find peace and to help our families and our communities to flourish. So in all the complexity, in all the ideology and all the noise, Lynn contends and I contend, and the book and the overarching message is that, most people are just trying to get by and look after themselves and their families, their health, their homes. Like, we're not actually after that much. Most of us aren't anyway. And somehow it gets convoluted, we end up on this kind of trajectory. Maybe it's because of mortgages, and maybe it's because of the demands and the pressures of modern life that we get pulled into this complexity of a rat race and so on. But when you boil it all down, like most of our primary, and this is the whole Maslow's hierarchy, like we're just kind of looking for the same things. And I think when you look at like a lot of the division that has occurred in the world, and certainly been stoked in the world, this idea that those people are bad and we're the good guys, and the Muslims are bad and the Christian, and vice versa and so on. Like most people are fundamentally good and fundamentally kind and decent. And that's what I met on this trip, where people wanted to give me a lift. They wanted to make me tea. They wanted to make me food. And it wasn't just because of me. It's because that innate goodness exists in most people. Okay, we're all going to have bad days. Some people go down dark roads. That's a fact as well. But you know, like there is a kindness and a decency that runs through humanity, and sometimes we forget that, particularly in an era of 24/7 news, and particularly when our Twitter feeds are bombarding us, and I'm guilty in the mix here, bombarding us with like all the travesty and injustice of the world, you know. But imagine like we flipped over and had like a good news Twitter feed, and it was just like, you know, all the goodness that I noticed today. And I suppose as things have slowed down in recent weeks with the lockdown and so on, I find myself just noticing things more, you know, because life is that little bit slower. And I'm just noticing like the beauty more, the beauty of nature. And there's something about the slowness that can allow us to be more. And I think there was a frenzy and a freneticism that was occurring, that was leading to a kind of societal burnout. So it's no surprise to me that mental health issues and pressures and stresses and depression have become like epidemic levels, where, you know, we have a very serious problem, because I think ultimately we've become disassociated with some of the fundamental things that make us happy. And our politics, unfortunately, haven't supported a society of well-being, which can identify health, housing, education, and not having to kill ourselves working all the time as important fundamental assets to, you know, important tenets rather to having a good, happy, healthy life. And I think that's what most of us want, is just to be happy and have a good life and have a good time as well.
Yeah, it's really, it's your health and your key people. It's when you strip it back, you realize what really matters. But like I remember in the TED talk that you did, you were quoting Aristotle kind of when you were talking about reflecting on the journey, and I wrote it down because I was never going to remember the quote. He was saying, the quote says, "Where talent meets the needs of the world, herein lies your vocation." And I wonder from your own perspective, like, as you were going through this journey, if you imagine kind of from that first night sitting in the tent shivering, going, what on earth am I doing, through to the final night of your journey when you're reflecting on the experiences, what you've taken from it, I kind of wonder, was the vocation emerging at that stage? Did you have a clear sense in your mind what was next for you from that experience? Or
yeah, so to be honest with you, I feel very fortunate that I feel that I found my vocation a long time ago. And I had an experience at university where I did a placement with a multinational, and I had to wear a suit and work in a pressurized job when I was very young. And it really made me miserable very fast. And I went on to do a few similar jobs after university, and they confirmed that I would be miserable if I continued on this path. And I was able to also then just see that where my interests and my passions were lying were constantly going to meetings and looking at books and websites and going to hear speakers, and they were all connected to community health, social issues. So part of me thinks it would have been lovely if I had been supported or realized maybe I should have studied social sciences or something, but maybe that doesn't matter. And you can change course at any age. You know, my parents have both studied when they were much older. My dad did a master's when he was about 60, you know. I did a degree in his late 50s and then a master's. And my brother was a mature student. And so the vocational bit, but, you know, the specifics of what to do next did not arrive by the end of the book. And the truth of the matter is they never arrived, ever, still to this day. And so I have been training myself somehow to live with uncertainty. And that in many ways has left me relatively well placed to deal with a pandemic, because a lot of the time my income levels aren't secure. It's just a particular path that I've ended up on. I don't think it's any better or worse than anybody else's path. So there's no judgment in any of this, but a lot of it is to do with uncertainty and not knowing what's around the corner or what mission I'm on next and where the call to adventure is coming next. And so a lot of the work is project based or campaign based, or I feel that, you know, for the last couple of years, I felt like a lot of my work was to write this book and finish this book. And that's what I needed to do. And so now I'm on to the next one. And just in the last few weeks, I was like, I wonder what my next thing's going to be. And at any one time, I have a few things going on. I have a podcast and I work with different charity groups and so on. But I knew that something else was stirring up, and you learn to hear this kind of little glimmer of a voice that emerges from the gut and then eventually comes up, and it's like, so it just told me to start writing again. And I was like, I don't know, I don't really like this writing business, you know. But I started writing again a few weeks ago, and it's just flowing off the page, and it's really caught me by surprise. And I just kind of believe and have the philosophy of seeing life as an adventure, because ultimately, you know, the days pass so fast, life passed so fast. And if we reflect a little bit on our mortality without getting in any way grim, like, you know, this isn't, as I interviewed Brona Gallagher on my last podcast, and she's like, this isn't a rehearsal. Get into it, you know. So she had that dairy firepower thing going on. But I believe her, and I think she's right, you know. I know we have to pay the bills. I don't like, you know, I think that's really important. That's a big driver for us, that we have to, and particularly be responsible for our families and children and so on. But I also think we deserve to have a good life and to enjoy life and to grow and to learn. And sometimes that means getting out of your comfort zone, whether it's hitching or whatever it is. You know, it's going to look like a different thing for everybody on this call. And I'm sure many people are already well on this journey and perhaps have mastered it. And if you have, I'd love to read your book, please. And I think, you know, that's all we can do for each other. And I think that's why what the event you've put on this evening is great, because all we're doing is sharing each other's stories and learning from each other. And I don't think anybody knows better than the other person. And I'm a big believer in stories as a forum for learning and exchange from each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's when you reference kind of being here this evening, I have found doing this web series or podcast, I'm still not 100% sure what to actually call it, but
the TV show.
In having these conversations that we've been doing every week since March, it actually has been the biggest privilege that I've had this year, because
there you go. Yeah.
It's amazing, but you get the opportunity to sit down in a collective each week and to talk to someone about something that they are really passionate about, knowledgeable about, and they really care. And it's been an incredible experience for me. But when you were talking, like a sense, kind of an idea that I got reading this book was this whole idea of the radical act of listening. Like, how has your approach to conversation or to listening changed or evolved, and even maybe referencing it in how it's influenced your podcast since going on this journey?
Yeah, so I love radio, and I love listening to radio, or I used to. And one of the things I noticed about a lot of particularly Irish radio, and there are some good shows and good presenters, but I noticed there wasn't a lot of listening going on, that it was just like filling in the slots and getting through the motions and fast and furious. And I just felt like that's just wiring up my adrenaline, and it's not really a deep and meaningful conversation that inspires me. And, you know, sometimes you do hear them, but that inspired me to start a podcast, and really just gave me the space to ask questions and pause. And I love the idea of the pause, you know, because and I actually ended up doing a 2-day. The people at Documentary on One, RTE, are some of the best people in the entire world in this whole audio storytelling world. I did the 2-day course with them, and they taught me like the power of the pause. And I think this can be a principle in life as well, is when you ask someone how are they doing, maybe like to pause, you know, because in Ireland we just hammer on, how's it going, and they might actually be feeling suicidal. That's the truth of the fact, you know. And like, we're all on a spectrum of wellness on any given day, where you could be 10 today and 3 tomorrow, you know. But the idea where we actually create space for each other to hear each other, I think creates a holding mechanism for society, for culture. And I think some of what's informing or manifesting in the more messy political realm is a response to people not being heard, you know. And when people don't feel heard, they're susceptible to going down other roads that maybe aren't as healthy, if you like. So I think we ultimately need more reflective, quieter and slower spaces for being. And I think perhaps there was an element of, and still is for many people, of religion and churches providing some of that. But I also believe in the secular potential there as well, you know. So I think that's part of the interest in the work of podcasts, but also in these conversations and people just making space for each other. And I think mindfulness and meditation have been big guiding practices for me. And my wife happens to be a meditation teacher, so I don't get away without learning and practicing also. Although I did fail to meditate this morning, and I felt it, you know. I was wired to all this election stuff, and thankfully I managed to rein myself in at like 11:30 this morning and sat myself on the couch and meditated for 10 minutes, and it entirely changed the shape of my day. 10 minutes, you know. And that then creates a calmness in my mind that when I meet the person down the street, when I was down walking earlier, I'm actually more present with them, and I can actually make space to listen to what they're really saying and not just rattle off stuff off the top of my brain about whatever Trump's latest tweet is, you know. So thankfully I did meet someone on the beach, and we had a very deep and meaningful conversation, and it had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with like something that was very pertinent for this person in that moment. And I'm not saying that, you know, that was because of me. I'm just saying when we create the spaces for each other, magic can happen and great things can happen, and we feel better and life is better and richer.
That's I think that idea of pause and of being, you know, taking care of yourself to the point that you can actually be more present for the people around you as well is incredibly powerful. I see a couple of questions that kind of would relate to this topic. Some are kind of questions or statements, depending which way you think about it. We've one guest who's, they were asking about a second part of the book, so I'm sure they're happy to hear that you're already writing. But
yeah, so I was going to go to another country and do something similar, and yeah, it doesn't seem like the timing is so good for that. But you know, that's what's interesting, is creativity is a funny thing, that I'm almost traveling without traveling at the moment. And because I kind of surrendered, I was like, okay, I spent a lot of my life thinking, where am I going to go next? And the pandemic and the situation we're in, you can fight it for sure, and some people are, but I've just kind of, I haven't like surrendered my rights or my sovereignty. You know, I'm still kind of free to go where I want to some extent, you know, but I want to be part of the collective effort. I want to believe in the collective and the public health collective, particularly for vulnerable populations. So there's a bigger conversation there when it comes to COVID. But I found myself that I'm able to like travel in my 5 kilometers and see the richness of what's in that 5 kilometers. So that's informing some of my writing at the moment.
Oh, wonderful! Yeah, I have found in my 5-kilometer radius, I've been following my dog's nose that I don't choose where I go walking. He does. And
yeah. The Tao of dog walking. Yeah, maybe your dog should write a book. And yeah.
He has. I have a lot to learn from that animal.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
Yeah, it's. I see another 2 comments here that one called McKiernan is asking, would you believe that you inspire other people? And then another person immediately after asks, do you do any workshops or gatherings for people who are interested in these sorts of topics?
So what was the first one?
Would you believe that you inspired other people?
I kind of believe we're all inspiring each other at any given moment, you know, like you can be inspired by a sentence you might hear on the radio when you're just turning on the radio driving or whatever. So I'm sure I have, but what may have inspired them isn't necessarily me per se, but rather a story. Like you know, the book is made up of many other people's stories. So the story that might inspire them is not my story effectively. So I don't know who's to say, but I do believe that we inspire each other, and I kind of big believer in that, you know. Isn't there some old saying about don't hide your light under the bushel kind of thing, where we do have a kind of tall poppy syndrome in Ireland sometimes, where we should kind of play ourselves down and be self-deprecating, and you know, don't put your head up too high, and you know, sure, what would I know, I'm no use anyway. And I do some of that as well. I'm like, oh, I'm not a very good writer, or oh, sure, my book will never be any good, but it's a load of shite, you know. And I think you have to kind of, whatever light is inside you, you have to kind of shine it out. And some people won't like it because it's not their vibe, and they like a different shade of light, you know, and that's fine. But you know, other people like other light, and I think when the more people do that, they can inspire each other.
Like, to people who are sitting here on this call this evening, like if we're going to kind of apply it a little bit, you know, this idea, as you've kind of said quite clearly over the course of the conversation, finding hope is not always easy. If I wanted to do something positive for myself, for my community, for my family today or tomorrow in finding hope, what would you say to me? Sorry.
Yeah, I can feel the clock ticking now to come up with a really profound answer. I sometimes do that at the end of my podcast. I say, like, have you any final pieces of wisdom? And a couple of people said no.
No.
But what would I say to you about finding hope? I would say make space for hope, you know, and that comes down to that pause again. But particularly in the era of noise and technology and busyness and pressure and worry and stress, to make some empty space in whatever form that is, if it's meditation or creativity or writing or art, or just standing by a tree and seeing what calls to you and what speaks to you. And you will never know what that call is, or what that message is, or what the invitation is, unless you make the space for it to arrive. And sometimes it's hard to discern what's just noise and what's somebody else's voice or fear. But I do believe that we all have some sort of inner GPS type system. I don't know what it's called. Like, it's some kind of guiding light within us that is unique to each of us. So I couldn't possibly speak to what it would be for you, but I do believe in the space.
Okay, and then I kind of, when we started talking about Hitchhiking for Hope, when we started talking about the book and I guess what motivated you to first go on the journey, you know, you were looking at this idea that you were looking at speaking about the citizens' views of the future here in Ireland. And I wonder, just to kind of, as kind of an ending sentiment, like, where do you think that's going? Like, when you're asked about your vision for the future and what you're hopeful for in Ireland, what do you see?
Yeah, I see a country that has a very troubled past, you know. Think of the troubles in the north in recent years. Like, I remember the Oma bomb. No, it seems like distant history, but it's not. And I'm thinking of the Magdalen laundries, you know, and the mother and baby homes, and the fight that we still had on our hands as recent as a week ago, and possibly still have, you know, for people to have their voices heard and their records and their rights. And so there's a lot of wounds and a lot of trauma walking and stalking the land effectively. But parallel to that is, I do believe that there's a kind of a reawakening and an awakening of a nation, and much of it's to do with, like, it being a young country, but it's not only to do with young people, it's to do with the elders also saying, no, like, I don't want that type of country anymore. I'm done with that kind of behavior. I'm done with that shadow secrecy and so on. And, you know, I think we've seen some of that play out in referendums. I think there's a lot of a kind of a feeling where Ireland could be a guiding light, you know. And I think we see that in New Zealand at the moment, in a lot of their decision making. I've spent some time in New Zealand in the past, and they have a thing that they call Kiwi ingenuity, because they're so far removed from the rest of the world that they've had to become self-reliant to some extent. And I see echoes of it in the Scandinavian countries and increasingly in Scotland. And some of this has to do with a lot of female leadership in the world and empathy and so on, but also like small, strong, independent nations that aren't insular thinking, that they're still outwardly looking part of the global world, global economy and so on, but they're confident in themselves. And I think we still have a little bit of growing up to do, you know, as a country. We're still looking over our shoulder, waiting for what's London going to tell us or what's Washington going to tell us. And you've seen in the last few years how those aren't great examples to be following right now, you know, and I think the pandemic is an example of that. So I would like to see us forge our own identity and our own path and our own course increasingly. And I believe that we're on course to do that if we don't falter. And the danger is that we falter and we lose momentum and lose belief in ourselves. But I think we might be on the cusp of something. And, you know, I choose to believe that. And I think the more you believe in it, the more you can manifest it. And then you create momentum and you create movements and we forge ahead.
I'm going to adopt your belief. I think we've some incredible people operating across our island these days. So I very much would believe everything that you're saying, and I'm hopeful for the future. No, I don't think I casually used the word hopeful ever before, so that in itself is a funny accident.
Yeah, well, look, I have my moments as well, you know. So it's a roller coaster, and I think you can have days, good days and bad days. But I think you have to put in the work and the practice, and that's, you know, if there's anything I'm going to hammer on about, it's the meditation stuff. But it's just finding some way of managing your mind and yourself and your health, and to keep yourself sane in a stormy sea. You know, I think is a Krishnamurti or one of these Indian sage folk talk about the question is, how can you be well in a sick sea, or how can a fish be well in a sick sea? You know, and like a lot of what's coming at us is quite toxic, and I think we do have the choice and the agency to turn that off and reclaim our houses and reclaim our minds and I mean, I'm into Bob Marley territory here, like free yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can, you know, free our minds. So I love, actually, speaking of reggae music, I always loved the like sunniness of reggae music and the happiness of a lot of it. But it doesn't shy away from the tragedy of life as well. But my wife and I often play reggae music in the morning and like get some cheeriness going on and start the day that way.
Oh, yes, please. It's I know my colleague Trevor has been trying to support me into starting to meditate for probably 8 years at this stage. So I'm sure he'll quote this conversation to me tomorrow morning. But I think unfortunately we've kind of reached that time. I see one of our guests this evening has written in saying that this has been their absolutely favourite session so far, and that they've been following you for a few years now, saying thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you for joining the sessions in times gone past, but that's really lovely to hear. It's Ruairí, I've thoroughly, hugely enjoyed speaking to you this evening and listening to you. So really, thank you so much for being here and for telling us.
Oh, thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined in. And a big hello to, I see Mirren's comments there. She's been a great supporter of the book. So thank you, Mirren. And I've seen someone in the US saying it's been a really stressful week. So yeah, big love to everyone there. I think the country's going through a moment. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, there's lots of good people doing lots of good work. And as I think it was Martin Luther King said, you know, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I hope I'm not misquoting, but, you know, things do change and they do come good, but sometimes it's after a lot of pain. But, you know, again, darkest hour before the dawn. And I've spent a lot of time in the US, and I've actually, you ask about inspiration, I've found so much inspiration from the US and American people, and there's such a goodness there as well. So, you know, we'll keep the good fight going on at home and abroad.
Exactly. Well, as we said, the book is Hitching for Hope, and I'm sure it's in all good local bookshops for anyone who is interested in continuing their time with Ruairí and with the conversation this evening. So that's it, unfortunately, for this week. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us for another week of 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. And just once again, Ruairí, thank you. And best of luck.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks to everyone. Hope to see you all along the way.
Good evening, everyone.